Welcome to yet another episode of Sacred Reviews. In this episode we're going to take a look at Genji, Days of the Blade, a PS3 launch title and sequel to Genji, Dawn of the Samurai on the PS2. Sadly, my first impression of it may have been a bit over the top, but Days of the Blade is a rather poor follow-up to Days of the Samurai. Though before I get into the gameplay, I should take a moment to examine the plot. Plot-wise, this game is still on the simple side and revolves around the Genji clan trying to put down the last remnants of the Heishi clan. In the most surprising event in gaming history, the Heishi clan turns to demonic powers in order to turn the tide of the battle, and rumors about this occurrence lead to Yoshitsune, Benkei, and Shinzuka getting pulled back in the center of this war. Outside this rather basic plot, the game also includes a plot twist that you'll see coming from a mile away and feels highly cliché. Sadly, this little plot is haunted by plot holes, and seems to break continuity with the previous game in a lot of places. One of the first issues is Yoshitsune meeting up with his brother. While this might be explained with the rumors about the Heishi forces, this isn't well established at the beginning of the game. And the last game ended with Yoshitsune swearing not to meet with his brother because he didn't want the Amahagane used as a weapon of war anymore. And even if that was the reason for the meeting, it still wouldn't make sense, since Yoshitsune practically took down the entire Heishi army on his own in the last game with the aid of Benkei and Shinzuka. So there's little reason for him to turn to his brother when he has the power to decimate entire armies thanks to the power of the Amahagane. Though the Amahagane themselves are a massive plot hole as well, since in the last game we saw Shinzuka fuse them together into a giant jewel, which begs two questions. Where did all of the playable characters get their Amahagane from? And where did the Super Amahagane go? It's these little details that make me think the Game Republic didn't put a lot of stock in people playing the last game, but these breaks of continuity need to be explained. I could offer up a bullshit explanation, but these sorts of questions should have been answered early on in the game itself. And while we're on the subject of unanswered questions, what happened to our other female compatriot from the last game? Seriously, she's never shown at all in this game, and her disappearance isn't even mentioned by any of the other characters. I mean, she also swore to help protect the Amahagane, so why is she missing? I understand their hesitation to use a damsel in distress as a combat character, but they could have at least brought her up. Though I guess I may be nitpicking at this point and should move on to the characters themselves, and much like the last game, they are all devoid of personality for the most part. Though I guess this is to be expected to a degree, since this game is a mythological retelling of actual events from Japanese history. Sadly, this lack of personality doesn't make the best/worst scene in this game any more bearable. Though if I were to explain why this scene is both the best and worst part of this game, I'll have to give away major plot spoilers. Generally speaking, the game was rather impressive for the time, even if it feels a bit dated now, considering we're nearing the end of the last generation of consoles and moving on to the PS4 and Xbox One. On the sound side of things, the game is still impressive in terms of music for the most part, but it still revolves around rather traditional Japanese instruments. On the downside, some of the new scores also include chants which are enjoyable at first, but start to become irritating after all since they feel a bit overused at times. Albeit the biggest problem in this game is the English voice acting. Most of the English voice actors fail to find a voice that fits their character, to be honest, and a lot of the voice actors either come across as horrendously bad or sort of top as hilarious. To demonstrate this, I will now show a short clip featuring Rule 63 Yoshitsune, who manages to be both awful and over the top simultaneously.
It's been scarred. No. Injustice. Lord Tomomori will never look at me now. How could this happen? What have you done? I'll never be able to face him again. Someone will pay for this. I'll kill you. Yes, that's what I'll do. I'll kill every last one of you. You peasants, come prepare to die!
Thankfully, this game does include the original Japanese audio, but you'll have to go into the options menu to switch over to it. Gameplay-wise is where this game really starts to fall apart. Sadly, my complaints about the camera and my first impressions of you can't be overstated. The camera is a constant problem throughout this game, makes many fights far more difficult than they need to be. This is especially true for many of the boss fights, since they can easily sneak behind you, and you're going to be completely dependent on using the mini-map. You can also try putting up the guard, but many of the bosses can easily shatter your guard, knock you on your butt, and damage you at the same time. And if you don't jump back up quickly enough, they might land a sadistic follow-up attack and do even more damage. So you're almost always going to be screwed in certain boss fights, especially near the end. Though the crab bosses can be annoying in one stage too, because they'll have 4 of them and you won't be able to follow them at all practically. They'll be constantly smashing you from behind, smashing you from behind, smashing you from behind. You won't be able to see them because the camera can't be re-aimed so you can look at what's in front of you. Drive you nuts. In fact, this inability to effectively see your enemies will force you to turtle your way throughout most of the game, which means combat feels extremely slow and painfully boring. To make matters even worse, the only character with a decent guard to deal with most of the enemies you'll come across is Benkei, so we largely ignore the other characters because they lack the ability to effectively turtle in this game. And this reliance on turtling makes the game feel like a boring chore instead of the fast-paced hack-and-slash game that we had in the previous game. Some of the character issues are compounded by Shinsuke's lack of defense, which pretty much puts her on the sidelines unless you're trying to solve puzzles or traverse some of the platforming sections. However, the character that has the worst fighter in my opinion is the freaking Japanese god of war, Bosun, or Basan, however you pronounce his name. He's terrible. All his attacks revolve around spinning his little weapon, and he almost always takes attacks from the sides, behind, above. He's useless. In fact, if you have to use any character in this game, I'd say stick with Benkei, and only switch out if you have to. And attempt to be fair though, there are 2 changes to this game that I like over the previous game, but their inclusion in no way makes up for all the other issues. I like the fact that, unlike the previous game where you had to go back to a central point to switch characters, in this game you can switch out on the fly by tapping on up, down, right, or left on the directional pad, which correspond to specific characters. Another change that I liked a lot was the changes to the combo system. Instead of the button timing, instead of having to press the X button at a specific time like the previous game, you press specific buttons on the controller and rack up damage, and can rack up a decent amount of weapon upgrade points through this method. In closing, Genji Days of the Blade is a disappointing follow-up to a rather decent hack-and-slash game on the PS2, and should be avoided at all costs unless you have a desperate need for a follow-up to the previous game. It's just not worth paying the $5 to get. And I'm serious, I paid $5 for this game, and I still feel like I was ripped off.